The Girl in the Barn, an original ghost story by Brenton French. When Eddie was a kid, around 10 years old, his sister, who was 13 at the time, played soccer on a youth girls travel team. Eddie wasn't very interested in sports, but he usually ended up traveling around with his family when his sister would go to games all around Northwest and Central Florida. Usually, while his sister was playing and his parents were watching the game, Eddie would go off by himself and explore the area around the soccer field. Depending on where the game was being played, there might be points of interest for Eddie to check out. Sometimes there would be woods to explore with trails and walkways, or a playground he could go to. On some unfortunate occasions, there wouldn't be anything in the immediate area around the soccer fields for Eddie to check out, so he would either have to pace around and wait for the game to end, or sit and watch. He never enjoyed that very much. In later years, looking back, Eddie really couldn't recall how many soccer games he had been dragged to, or all the places he had gone and explored, but there was one event that stood out in his mind. One Saturday afternoon in early October back in 1995, when his sister was playing at a recreation complex just outside of Tallahassee, Florida, Eddie went exploring. Eddie told his mom he was going off to explore. She told him to be careful and not to go too far. Recently, there had been news that a young girl around his age had gone missing in a neighborhood nearby. He reassured his mother that he would not go too far and he would not speak with any strangers. Eddie's idea of what was far was a little farther than what his mother would have been comfortable with. Just past the edge of the soccer field, there was a grassy hill that dropped down to the edge of a thick forest. Eddie walked down to the edge of the woods and did a little looking around. Eventually, he found a trail. This trail led down through the woods into a cypress swamp, over a boardwalk and past a deep black lake. He followed the trail along the shore of the lake to the far side. There, he eventually came to a barn of sorts. The barn was very old and dilapidated, and it seemed to have been abandoned. The area surrounding the barn was overgrown with waist-high grass, and kudzu covered the rusted tin roof. Eddie thought to himself that the place looked very haunted, and feeling adventurous, decided to go inside. Exploring inside the barn, he found a series of empty horse stalls filled with old junk, mainly disused signs from around the recreation complex. He explored the barn for a few minutes and was getting ready to leave when he happened to notice a door hidden behind a pile of junk in the very back of the barn. Curious as ever, Eddie decided to move the junk and look behind the door. Here he found a tall, narrow staircase leading up into the top of the barn. Eddie slowly and carefully made his way to the top of the stairs. They creaked as he walked. At the top of the stairs he found a dimly lit room, dry and closed off from the elements. The loft was a room about 15 feet across and 12 wide, with a single window to allow in sunlight. Aside from an old wooden chair that sat in the very middle of the room and piles of straw that lay strewn about, the room was completely empty. Eddie made his way across the room, past the chair and towards the window on the far side. He looked out at the swamp. There was something very strange about this loft room. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there really wasn't anything in here, so he was bored and was about to turn around and leave when he noticed the girl. He hadn't seen the girl when he first came into the room. She was just standing over in one corner, just standing and staring at him. She was just a little taller than him, but she looked to be around the same age. The girl was very pale. She had long black hair and was wearing baggy clothes that seemed too large for her body. Eddie really couldn't quite place the look she was giving him, but she was staring very intently at him. "Oh, I'm sorry," Eddie said, surprised by the girl's appearance. "I didn't think there was anybody here." The girl didn't speak a word. She didn't move. She just stood there, leaning in the corner and staring back at Eddie. Something about this girl was making him so uncomfortable. It was scary. Are you okay?" Eddie asked. The girl just continued to stare, not saying a word. Eddie suddenly felt that he should not be in this place, and at that very moment, he heard his mother calling him. Eddie didn't even attempt to make any sort of explanation to the strange girl who was staring at him. He rushed past her, down the stairs, out of the barn, and back down the trail towards the soccer fields. Eddie's mom was furious with him when he came back. He had gotten into trouble, but Eddie didn't really care. He was just happy to have gotten back from that barn and away from that creepy girl. The event haunted Eddie for some time to come, and he would often recall the barn and the girl that just stood there in the corner staring at him. He always wondered what it was she was thinking. Years later, when Eddie and his sister were adults, his sister became the coach for the same youth travel team she had played on as a child. Eddie and his family were over in Tallahassee for a shopping trip when they got a call from his sister saying the team was having a game and they should come to watch. Eddie's parents, feeling nostalgic, decided that they would go and watch the game. Eddie was as disinterested as ever, but decided that he would accompany his parents to the recreation park where the game was being held. It was shortly after they had arrived that Eddie began to recall the recreation complex and the trail he had walked on all those years ago. He decided it might be interesting to check the place out as an adult and revisit it. He walked down the trail just as he had those many years ago. He found the trails had not been very well maintained. They were very overgrown, and when he came to the boardwalk that led through the cypress swamp, it creaked unsettlingly, and some of the rails and boards were completely rotted away to nothing. After all he had seen along the overgrown trail, Eddie was surprised to find that the barn was relatively the same as it had been the last time he'd seen it. He half expected that the barn would have been torn down or rotted away to nothing. He walked into the barn just as he had those many years ago, through the horse stalls, and he found the door in the back corner of the barn. Eddie paused for a minute, remembering that girl he'd seen. He didn't really want to go back up there, but he had to. Something inside told him he had to go back up those stairs and into that room. Morbid curiosity pushed him onward, up the stairs. He came to the filthy, dry loft. The same chair sat in the center, and the hay was still scattered all around the room. He looked around. Slowly, when his eyes at last fell into the corner where he'd seen the girl all those years ago, he thought his heart would stop. The girl was still standing there. The same girl leaning up in the corner staring at him. In height, the girl had not changed at all. She was still the same height of a child around the age of 10. She was still wearing those same baggy clothes, though now they seemed to fit her even more loosely, and they were covered in filth. Eddie was horrified to see her standing there, just as he remembered her, but now she was even more horrible. Her face was a dark leathery mask, clinging to white skull. Her black lips were withered and screwed over her teeth in a maniacal grin, and her eyes. She had no eyes. They were just black sockets. It was in that moment that Eddie knew why all those years ago the girl had given him the creeps. She was a corpse. This was the same girl he'd heard of, the one who had gone missing in the neighborhood near the recreation complex. The same girl who had been missing since 1995. Eddie had found her body all those years ago without even realizing it, and her body had been sitting up in the loft of this barn, rotting for all those years.